I actually want to get some of your reactions to some of those moves. And you touched on them a little bit already, like talking about San Diego and some of the moves that they're making. And Alex Morgan was a very recent move that they announced. And at the time of our recording, there's not a ton of information in terms of goods exchange, right? Like assets exchange, right? There's just an announcement that Alex Morgan, yes, is heading from Orlando Pride to San Diego. And there were obviously a number of other trades that got announced within that very chaotic kind of trade window. Red Stars and Angel City making headlines with Julie Ertz and Sarah Gordon heading over to Los Angeles. Ali Krieger and Ashton Harris heading over to Gotham FC. North Carolina sending Samantha Mewis to Kansas City Current. And Thorns trading Simone Charlie and Tyler Lucy to sort of ensure that there was going to be some roster protection for them ahead of the expansion draft as well. So in terms of maybe some of these big names tied to the trade window, did you have like a bigger reaction to one more than the other out of all of these moves that took place?
Well, before I started texting with my friends Ali Krieger and Ashlyn Harris, I was like, what is happening here? But then it all made sense once some of the other trades started taking place, and Gotham, Caitlin Sheridan going to the San Diego Wave, they're starting goalkeeper, Didi Herrera going to Angel City. So it made sense they needed a goalkeeper, right? And I think, again, it goes back to sometimes as players, it's time for you to move on, just like as coaches. Right. And so to find a new environment, and for those two players in particular, I think that was the case. And it kind of was a perfect storm for Gotham as well to get some experienced players and a proven quantity in goal. I like the approach of a lot of teams. I think it makes sense to go with trying to get immunity in these drafts and like protect the core of your team, especially if you felt like the year was successful and you want to continue to build on that. And that's always what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to give up a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. I do think there were some interesting moves where some teams didn't have to give up anything and still got immunity and got paid, and like there's some weird things. I'm like, what kind of deals are happening here? But I would say the other one that was pretty big was Sarah Gordon and Julie Ertz. But huge credit to Sarah Gordon, because I mean, what she's done over her career, and she deserves that, right? She deserves the ability to say yes to that or no, really. And so those two big moves, I think, big pickups for Angel City, and we'll see what goes on with Chicago, still keeping a lot of the team intact. But those are two big players that have been mainstays for them, outside of Julie Ertz being injured, obviously, this past season. But
Lori, I can't agree with you more. There were so many times I was like reading the fine print of these trades being like, is this all you got in return? But hey, I think expansion draft protection was a hot commodity throughout this NWSL offseason and all of the different trades that happened. I mean, Sandra and I have dove into it a number of times, but not just with players and with teams and trades and coaches being announced, but this NWSL draft that is scheduled for Saturday was originally supposed to be in person in LA along with the expansion draft. And then honestly, last minute, it got changed to be virtual. And I know we talked with Marissa Pilla about this a little bit, and like the changing of flights and now you're changing location because the draft is virtual. But for you as someone that is an analyst heading into this draft, and you've been an analyst at drafts in person and also virtually last year in 2020. Does your prep change, and how much of a curveball was that thrown to you when the draft got moved from being in person to virtual?
Yeah, no, I mean, my prep doesn't change at all. It's always fun to be in person, just like the same as calling games at the stadium, right? Instead of doing it virtual, which we had to do some during COVID. And, honestly, I think it makes the most sense in the end to make sure that everyone's safe and, cut down on some travel. But I think anytime you have a couple expansion teams coming in, and then also a college draft, and we were bundling those together, it is always a bummer, though, because you want to be around there. You want to feel the energy of the two expansion teams and their front office and how excited they are. You can have players live there. So there's a different energy that you get. But at the end of the day, I mean, the prep stays. It's still these players exciting for them in terms of their future, and that shouldn't change, right? I think because we need to keep what's most important, which is teams picking up great young talent that are going to strive to play at the next level. And the expansion draft, we'll see, right? That'll be interesting. There's a few names on there that I'd be like, I'm taking that person. But I've seen weirder things, so who knows who will be left on the table or not.
All right. Speaking of weird things, look, San Diego and Angel City, they flipped a coin for the first pick in the expansion draft and then the NWSL draft. And San Diego won the coin flip, and they chose in the first round, and they're going to choose in the first round in the NWSL draft, and that deferred to Angel City for them to have the first pick in the expansion draft. So when it comes to the weird things, what are your thoughts on this? Like the type of coin flip that it is, and if you're going to be rocking the GM cap for us for this question, if you're the one having to make that decision for the coin flip, do you go the route of expansion draft first, or do you go the route of NWSL draft?
Great question. And typically I would 100% go expansion draft, right? Well, I guess 100% is a little extreme because I'm going to say no to this. But
typically is such a qualifying word because nothing is typical this year.
Yeah, exactly. I think even with two teams coming in, I think, and we can get into this later on in this episode as well, but the landscape is changing so much, and it's becoming increasingly more difficult for these players to come in from the college level and make a huge impact, right? Consistently get a starting position. Now, I'm not saying not anybody, right? As we mentioned, Trinity Rodman was lights out, one of the best forwards, if not the best forward in the league. Emily Fox, right? The 1 and 2 picks came in and made huge splashes in the league. However, I think when you look at there's going to be 50 picks, that's difficult, right? For those players to come in and consistently be able to perform it and start. So I would typically go the route of, yes, get the expansion draft, go get the number 1 so that you can pick players that have proven themselves, because there's always going to be players that have done well that are going to be available because you can't protect everybody. But I think in San Diego's respect, it was smart to go with the number 1 pick in the college draft over the expansion draft, given how many teams had already done trades, immunity. I mean, there's going to be like what? I'm exaggerating, but like 2 picks basically, available, like 1 pick an hour, right? And then, okay, call it quits. So I think, again, as you mentioned, nothing has been typical this year. There's been a lot of movement. And so San Diego has to go with what they feel, I think, they know. And, as we alluded to earlier, I would imagine it would be Jaelin Howell. And this is a young player that has gotten some caps with the national team. I think the college game was almost been too easy for her the last couple seasons and has a huge upside. And if you're looking for a player of her caliber in that position, then hell yeah, you go for it, right? And then you set yourself up to be able to have some picks for the future as well, I should say.
I want to know what kind of coin it is. Like, is it like a quarter? Is it like a silver, like dollar piece?
It's going to be a silver dollar.
Is it
okay? I was going to say, like,
have you seen like the coin flips online? Is it that? Like, that's so lame. Come on,
got the intel?
Flip a real coin.
Yeah, who's got the intel? What kind of coin is there? Or like, let's move away from it. Like, this is like, let's get in some like real American like soccer culture traditions. Like
poker. Whoever wins gets to pick what they want.
Let's like have like the 2 GMs have to like thumb wrestle. And like the winner will like get to choose.
Exactly what we're gonna do. That would actually fit perfectly into this year, right? Like
if there was ever a year where like there needed to be that introduction of like a non-coin flip, like a game, as opposed to like a coin flip, like this should have been the year.
That's exactly it. That's what it should have been, honestly. All right, Lori, we'll have you take off your GM cap for now, putting back on the analyst cap, because you are really a namesay in a lot of NWSL homes, being the color analyst for a lot of games. And anyone listening out there that really only follows the NWSL, you're missing out on a huge chunk of women's soccer that starts at the college level and in the college game. And Lori, you call NCAA Division I soccer games in the SEC and the ACC, where you are watching and analyzing and really evaluating top level college talent throughout the entire season. And we know how those regular season games and then into conference games can really change as players head into their final season. And also with COVID years, lots of things are changing. But for you, as an analyst that does call NCAA Division I games, and you get a sneak peek at a lot of these players that register for the NWSL draft, does the prep help you when you call those college games? Are you keyed in a little bit on what players should? And then when you see the final registered player list, are you like, wow, where is this player? I thought they did fantastic this year.
Yeah, it certainly does help in a massive way. Being able to see some of these players over the last few seasons, especially in college, and then, yeah, I think in general, has this been a little bit of a weird draft period for sure, right? Given just exactly what you said, and I think it will be maybe for the next couple of years until it kind of dwindles out or the cutoff period of there's not going to be an additional COVID year for a certain class, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's the beauty of it for these players to decide whether or not they're going to stay in, whether they're going to take their additional COVID year or come out early. And that is completely up to the player. And I think it's an individual choice. And, I thought maybe we'd see a few more come out this season, given just the fact that this isn't taking away from any of the talent that's in the draft, right? It's just not the strongest draft that we've ever seen. And that's just how it is. And what I mean by that is we had a lot of top level players in college this season that were already drafted in the 2021 draft, right? But they stayed their additional year and didn't go. So now they'll be going in to the NWSL team and haven't played a pro minute yet. And then you have this class where there's some people or some players that we thought maybe would come out, but decided to stay. So it's a smaller pool of, I think, some of the top players that we would have expected to see.
When you're doing your preparation, did that stuff have to come into play? I mean, it had to, compared to other drafts that maybe you've had to prepare for, keeping in the back of your mind, well, a ton of these players who are eligible, right? Or would have been eligible, actually got selected.
Yeah. And I really enjoy this conversation or this part of it too, because I think it is interesting because we are at a pivotal point where I think there's going to have to start to be better communication between the pro coaches and the college coaches. Now, that's not to say that there's not that happening. And I think for sure that is happening in terms of identifying players. But I think a real clear understanding of what it means in kind of the next couple of years, because is everyone that's playing college soccer at the Division I level or even in some of the lower divisions, are they wanting to go pro? No, we don't need to pretend that that's the case. But there's a lot that do, right? And to navigate and when is going to be your best opportunity to get picked is going to continue to have to be a conversation going forward, especially with the limited roster spots. It's only 12 teams right now, right? And we expect more to come in eventually. But that's not very much. When you think about how many college soccer players there's not a ton of opportunity for them to find a roster spot, right? So do you either play in NWSL? Do you go overseas? So I think that conversation is going to have to come in because, to your point, this would have been a great year for some of those players to come out to ensure getting drafted, to get themselves even a better look, to get a year underneath their belt, right, before maybe a potential tougher class comes in next year that's even more saturated with talent because of just the overflow of the COVID year.
Lori, you're almost alluding to this, but that communication between the college coaches and the NWSL coaches, I'm sure it's there, but of course, transparency and communication that can always be elevated and always honestly just made better overall. So as a player in college, not really knowing if now's the time to go, when it is to go. I mean, you've been in these draft rooms as a player through a number of different leagues that were thrown into the mix over the last several years. But as those players sitting there now at their homes, I guess virtually, but how much confusion and how much uncertainty is it going into Saturday afternoon, knowing that you could potentially be drafted, or honestly not knowing at all? What are these players thinking at this point?
Yeah, I mean, When I was drafted too, I mean, it was a bit more straightforward than we're seeing now, and there wasn't as many question marks, right? But I don't want to take away either. Yes, there is some confusion. But there's excitement, right? Like this is the next step. This is what you've worked for. This is awesome, and to have the chance to be able to get drafted and at least get a chance to even be like picked up by a team, right? Because just because you don't get drafted either doesn't mean that you can't be called into preseason and end up making. I mean, I think there's a gazillion pathways for these players. So I'm like all for it. But yeah, it's awesome. It's the next step. I mean, it's very similar to what it was like to sign your letter of intent to play in college. And then it's just another 4 years of commitment and now hopefully the next step, right? But I will say it's, you get almost like 4 years, depending on where you go to school, like of nurturing, right? In a community feel. And this is different, right? It's pretty, let's be honest, pro soccer, it's cutthroat and it's like a family, and it also cannot be, right? So I think that's where it comes into having, a lot of these players would have their college coaches to rely on. But to continue to ingrain that even more, right? Understanding the league, understanding it as a whole, what are coaches looking for? And, these are just the trials and tribulations this year, I think, for everybody and for even the pro coaches as well, to identify players and what's best for them.